Welcome to Iconoclasts, a program dedicated to exploring the mindset of innovators. Today I'm interviewing Greg Galant, who Business Week calls one of the best young tech entrepreneurs of 2010. Greg is the CEO and co-founder of Muck, a software platform for journalism and media. The Next Web has called Muck one of the most useful inventions ever for journalism. Greg is also the co-founder and executive producer of the Shorties, an award program honoring the best of social media, with past recipients including Mike Bloomberg, Ricky Gervais, Cory Booker, and Sesame Street, to name a few. Greg, welcome to Iconoclasts.
Thanks for having me on.
So, as a lifelong entrepreneur, tell us what led up to your first entrepreneurial venture at the young age of 14.
So I got on the internet really early by way of Prodigy, which is one of the early ISPs like AOL, where you dial in and be able to connect with people. I remember Prodigy gave everybody a little bit of web space. I think it was a megabyte at the time, which seemed like a lot. And I decided to just try putting up my own website. And after I did, I was kind of thrilled with that idea that I could build something and other people around the world could see it. So I thought I could kind of challenge myself to make more websites and make some money at the time by starting a company to build websites for other businesses, which I did, and had customers ranging from a chain of local newspapers to a French philosopher to a clinical labels company.
What kind of a website does a philosopher need?
This is actually BHL. He's one of the biggest philosophers in France. Here in America, it's hard to make a living as a contemporary philosopher, but in France you can do quite well. This guy lives in a castle and married to a supermodel. So if you're going to be a philosopher, much better to happen to be a French philosopher.
That defies the stereotypes. So was there any skepticism from these companies about your age?
Oh, a lot. When I was, well, there was a lot of skepticism, less about my age, more about just the idea of needing a website. So I didn't have to convince people, like, it wasn't a sale like, of course you need a website, here's why you should choose me.
Right.
It was, this is what a website is and your company should have one. And most businesses were skeptical. They needed a website back then.
Wow.
But once I convinced them they needed a website, it actually worked well being younger because websites hadn't been around that long. So no one could make the argument they'd been building websites for years, a decade, et cetera. So while you wouldn't want to choose an accountant who has 1 year experience, or you wouldn't want to choose a lawyer with a year experience.
Let alone a 14-year-old accountant.
That's right. And those professions have been around for longer. So you expect to be able to find an accountant with 20 years experience. It was almost like back then, if you claimed to have 10 years experience building websites, you were lying because they didn't exist. And it gave me, as an upstart, a big edge because people were willing to take a flyer working with someone younger on their website because they knew that you had more credibility kind of being in that world and being as experienced as you could be.
So very early interest in tech and coming of age at a really key time, right? With the web just starting. What other social and environmental factors, if any, do you think supported your entrepreneurial activity from such a young age?
I think there's an element. I always just loved starting things. I was definitely the kid always doing a lemonade stand, elements like that on the block. My parents were very supportive too, which helped a lot. And some of it too, I think just being a bored kid growing up in the suburbs helped too. Back then, if you didn't have a car, there wasn't too much you could do. So I had lots of time on my hands just to delve into it. But I just found that ability to create, to work with businesses and solve their problem, that was really kind of thrilling and created a lot of satisfaction.
And I happen to know personally, you're very interested in philosophy. How would you say the study of philosophy has impacted your career trajectory?
Yeah, it's funny. So I went to school originally intent on studying business, and then I took first I took my intro to philosophy course and loved it. Then I took a few business courses, and I felt like it wasn't, having done a business, I felt like it wasn't terribly relevant, at least not for undergrad business. But then in the philosophy department, I liked that they were honest. First of all, no one in the philosophy department was pitching it like the business school of saying like, oh, this is going to be super useful in your career. And on the other hand, I found it very intellectually stimulating. I liked the talking about ideas and writing and all that. But funny enough, I've actually found that philosophy has been extremely useful in my career, and it continues to get more useful as we grow. Because one of the biggest jobs of an entrepreneur is to kind of see the world, see the market, see cultural trends, which is all messy, and then figure out from it, like, what's a premise, where can you, as a new business, find your place in that and make it better. In a way, that's what you're doing in philosophy too. Any philosopher, they kind of look at the world, look at humanity, look at ethics, which is all messy and could be meaningless. But then they figure out some way to construct a narrative around it and explain it. So it's been useful both in that developing clear ideas, even more important, communicating ideas clearly. And that matters at the beginning a lot because you have to communicate the idea to the customers, to the market, to the press. Oftentimes before you have a product you can show. And now that we're bigger, I find it's been very valuable because almost all of my job now is just communicating ideas, not only to our customers, but to our team. And I can't really do any of the work myself. I have to make sure our team's working on the right stuff. So kind of having that experience communicating ideas has been very useful to me.
Is there any school of philosophy that's been more influential for you than others?
I always like kind of the moral and political philosophers. More recently, I've been getting a lot into the Stoic philosophers, which was one of the Hellenistic schools. So in Greece and Rome back then, it's funny how much philosophy's changed. Right now, when you hear philosophy, you think about this kind of existential, like, do we exist? How do we know we exist? But in Greece and Rome, there were these philosophical schools. There was the Cynics, with Cynicism, Epicureanism, with Epicurus, of course, he started it, and then the Stoics, but they were all these kind of philosophies of life where they were actually meant to answer questions on how you live your life. So studying philosophy wasn't this kind of in the clouds activity. It was actually thinking about, applied, how should you live? What's the right thing to do?
Very interesting. Now, shifting gears a little, before you became an entrepreneur, you did a brief stint as an employee. Talk to us about your experiences at CNN as an associate producer and then in venture capital, and how those experiences contributed to your transition to full-time entrepreneurship.
Sure. So when I was in college, I spent one summer the year before graduating working at a venture capital firm, helping them to source deals and find things to invest in. And then as I was finishing up college, I worked as an associate producer at CNN.com down in Atlanta. And it was actually from commuting from the university I went to CNN's headquarters. I kept getting stuck in Atlanta traffic, and I hated Atlanta radio. So I was thinking, like, wouldn't it be great if there was something else I could listen to in the car? This was 2004, 2005, just when the iPod had come out.
Wow.
I had this idea, like, oh, what if I could get the MP3s from CNN's news and put that on my iPod? I started doing some research, and the term podcasting, it was maybe mentioned once or twice back then. People called it RSS feeds with enclosures. Not quite as catchy. But I fell in love with this idea that I could get new content, new spoken word content automatically on my iPod. I was researching it, and I tried pitching to CNN the idea of launching a podcast back then. And they showed me like their list of changes they wanted to make to their website that was already scheduled out a year. I thought it was extremely well-run business, but I just realized, like, maybe this isn't the place for me because I want to just be launching stuff fast. So when I graduated, I decided I just wanted to start a podcast to see what that was all about. Because it felt like when I was 14 and like the web just came out. Like, I'm like, this is something new and exciting, and I want to be a part of it. I was trying to think of a good topic for a podcast. And back then, it's so much different now, but back then there was almost no information on the web about how entrepreneurs really started companies. All you could find were like these 500-word stories where it'd say Joe started a company, and then next thing you know, it's worth $1 billion. And I would always be like, wait, there's one sentence in between those two, and what did they really do to go from nothing to being a large company? So I had this idea, like, what if I just did interviews with entrepreneurs about how they started their business, but actually kind of went into detail with them and really just asked them all the questions that I wanted to know as an entrepreneur. It even seemed from my time in venture capital, where we were looking to invest in companies, that most entrepreneurs back then, and again, I think this has changed a lot now, but they'd be working on their own business, but they weren't necessarily in touch with any other entrepreneurs, particularly if they weren't in Silicon Valley, which I wasn't. So I started this podcast in 2005. I think it's fair to say it might have been the first podcast about entrepreneurship. Definitely the first interview podcast about entrepreneurship.
Venture Voice.
Venture Voice, yeah. And I remember the first person I pitched on being on it was the CEO of a company called FeedBurner. This guy, Dick Costello, who later became the CEO of Twitter and took Twitter public. I remember I called up FeedBurner's main phone number. I said, this is Greg Galant. Who can I speak to about setting up an interview with your CEO? Meanwhile, if you looked at my website, the Venture Voice was just a logo. There's no credibility to it. And then on the other end
how old are you now? 21?
Yeah, this would have been, I guess, probably 21, 22, however old I was when I graduated. And on the other end of the line, he says, this is Dick, I'm the CEO. I'm like, oh, hey, want to come on my podcast? He's like, yeah, sure. You can give me a call. Monday, and happy to do your podcast, but one condition. So yeah, sure. What's that? He's like, you've got to call me on my cell phone. And I didn't really know anything about production then, but I'd read some articles online, and they all said back at the time, like, never interview somebody on their cell phone because the sound quality sucks.
Right.
That might have changed now, but back then the sound was definitely bad. I figured I got nothing to lose. So I said, yeah, sure, I'll call your cell phone, but you mind if I ask why? It's like, yeah, we only have one line in our office here. So if I'm talking to you on this podcast, customers won't be able to get through. That makes a lot of sense. So I had him on, then I had Reid Hoffman on, the founder of LinkedIn, back when LinkedIn was about a 30-employee company, the founder of Yelp, and then I got dozens of other entrepreneurs, and I was able to get people of bigger stature at the time too. So founder of Brooklyn Brewery, founder of Vanguard Group, and a whole bunch of others.
Very exciting. And you said a large part of why you did it is the opportunity to ask questions you wanted the answers to. How did they do it? Did you notice any commonalities across the interviews in terms of personality traits or mindset?
It's funny, I thought going in that there'd be a lot more consistency than there was. Like, I was thinking, oh, maybe entrepreneurs need to be introverts or extroverts. Maybe you have to be a wonderful salesman. And what I found was interviewing them, some of them were gregarious and charming, could go on forever. Others were actually kind of awkward and not terribly articulate, especially back then. It's changed. This again has changed a lot. Now it's cool to be an entrepreneur.
Yes, there's a
they're stars. They get media trained, so even if they're not by nature that outgoing, by the time they're interviewed, they're probably decent at it. But back then, nobody was recording them. So a lot of them weren't media trained, and even very successful entrepreneurs might not be good in front of the press. So anyhow, I found that there wasn't a lot of consistency with anything except a tremendous amount of resiliency. And this is one thing that was really cool about the hour-long format, is every entrepreneur has edited versions of their origin story, myself included, where if I sit down with somebody at a bar and I have 30 seconds to tell them my story, I edit out all the failures along the way. And if I have a longer time, there's of course stuff that didn't work that I'm not going to go into in a short amount of time, but in a longer amount of time, I hear it. And so when I was doing this podcast, I found out that just about everyone had businesses that have totally flopped, or had moments where they can't make payroll or lose a big customer, or just have these, reversals that seem devastating. And I think that can be really hard for entrepreneurs, because often they only hear the rosy story.
Yeah.
So then when they have that devastating moment, not only is it devastating, but they think of all their heroes and like, oh, nothing they never screwed up this much. But it turns out pretty much all of them did. So the only thing I thought was consistent among all the entrepreneurs that I've talked to is that they're resilient.
Yeah, and this is before, I guess, the coherent Silicon Valley, mindset or culture had really fully formed, because now we have the culture of failure. There are failure conferences, failure is celebrated, business leaders speak very openly about their failure. How has failure contributed to your growth as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, it's been tremendous. I've had many businesses that didn't work. Actually, alongside the podcast that I started, I then had the idea to launch a podcast advertising network and ad serving platform. So I was thinking all these podcasts are coming out. Wouldn't it be great if there were a way to just get ads for podcasts and both had an ad network and then could also serve the ads dynamic into the audio? So I started a company doing that. And in retrospect, it's clear, although I had no idea at the time, that it was about 10 years too early to market. So companies have done that now that are very successful, but everyone who started a company back then, it didn't work out for. And I was basically, pounding my head against the wall for over a year trying to sign up companies. And we got customers like Business Week and The Street, and we got some big names in it, Focus Features, but it was always small deals, and the big audience and money never flowed into podcasting for another really 5 or 10 years since then. So on one hand, it was like a painful experience of being way too early to market.
Okay.
On the other hand, I learned a tremendous amount from it, and there were lots of things that I did with that business that I then applied to later businesses when my timing was right. And it's also tricky because to some degree you never know. So, there were a lot of smart people, very experienced entrepreneurs who entered the podcasting world in 2005. Actually, one of the guys I had on my podcast was Ev Williams, who started a company called Odeo that itself was a podcasting company and directory. Odeo didn't work out. He pivoted into their side project, Twitter. And then that led to Twitter, which actually is what led me into further ventures. But both and Ev had previously started Blogger, which was one of the first blogging platforms he sold to Google. So you look at, even Evan Williams, who's an amazing entrepreneur, started, one multi-billion-dollar company, and then, Blogger, and then since Medium, which are also hugely successful, top 100 websites. And so even he'll make a timing mistake. Because, or I shouldn't even say mistake, but probably bad bet's a better way to phrase it. But there's that element where you never know the future. So even the best entrepreneur with the best business plan can still be wrong. But I think that's where it comes to resiliency, and that's where it also comes to. I've always tried to figure out how to launch businesses in the most capital efficient way possible, with the idea that if it doesn't work.
Right.
It doesn't mean bankruptcy and devastation. It just means okay, let's try something new.
Well, that kind of segues to the next question I had for you. Given the inherently risky nature of entrepreneurial activity, what is your risk management strategy?
Yeah, I'm always looking at ways to mitigate risk. And I think one really important thing is to think carefully about the worst case scenario and then also mitigate for it. And that can be powerful not only in terms of avoiding risks, but in being able to take risks. Because a lot of times two people could do the same thing, and one of them could do it in a way where they're taking a huge risk, another one could take a small risk. So for example, when we launched the Shorty Awards, we put up the website allowing anyone to vote with a tweet. It was about a $30 a month hosting plan. We had to spend $8 buying the domain name shortyawards.com, which was the entirety of our marketing budget. But we hadn't yet committed to a venue. We didn't promise people that there'd even be an event. We just said, hey, it's an award show. You could vote for people on the web. So it wasn't like we were making a false promise. It was just you'll vote, they'll get online recognition. So, and of course, in our case, we were fortunate. Our timing was perfect in retrospect. We were the first to build a system where people could vote with a tweet. So it went viral within 24 hours. And then very quickly, I had the confidence that we could pull off the event. But that's an example where it ended up working, and we ended up putting on an event that cost a good amount of money and got sponsors to cover it and made a profit. But the worst case scenario of the Shorty Awards was nobody would care about the website, and we would have been out $8 for domain name, $30 a month for hosting, and 2 weekends of our time building the website.
Basically less than $100 in 2 weeks of your time. Okay, yeah.
And it's not only on the web. Of course, I mean, this is one of the great things about the web is that your risk can be so low, because if you know how to build websites on your own and know how to build product, that's really your only cost nowadays, especially with cloud storage. But I've seen people apply it even in other areas, like Danny Myers, the restaurateur behind Union Square Cafe and later started Shake Shack. In his book, he talks a lot about how whenever he would negotiate a lease for a restaurant, he would always negotiate a way to get out of the lease should the restaurant not work. And most of his restaurants worked. I think it was only his maybe 5th restaurant that he had to close down. But looking at how thoughtful that was, where they happened to have worked, but it could have been that he opened up in a neighborhood that then went downhill. There are so many things outside of your control that can blow you up, and he structured it so that he could afford to fail and still go on, and the risk wasn't as big as it could have been.
He really minimized the downside, avoided bankruptcy, set himself up to take the failure, learn from it, and carry it forward into a new venture.
That's right. So I think whereas people think like entrepreneurs are risk takers is kind of the classic thing, they are, but I think entrepreneurs are really risk mitigators and managers, where they take risks, but they can only take the risk because they're doing the work to mitigate it and be smart about when to take the risk if they want to actually stay entrepreneurs for a long time. Richard Branson's another great example where the Virgin Group has been around for a long time, one of the most iconic brands out there, but every venture of Virgin is structured as its own company so that should any of them not work, and many of them haven't worked, it doesn't take down his whole enterprise. Most recently, Virgin America didn't work out. And I mean, he wrote, he cried about it, and it was painful, but the rest of his Virgin still exists. Virgin Atlantic, Virgin Galactic, all these other great companies are still up and running, and Richard Branson's still in business.
Very strategic, calculated risks. Let's talk about the Shorties. So what led up to the creation of the Shorties?
So it was funny enough, from doing that podcast and from, away from filming and podcasting, but being in that podcast world early on, that's what led me to get onto Twitter super early, because I was following Ev's work. So I got @Gregory on Twitter just by being the first person to sign up to Twitter and trying to get @Gregory. I didn't even try calling in a favor. And so I was on Twitter in those early days, and I got on back in 2006. Twitter took a couple of years before it really got popular. And then by 2008, I saw it had kind of hit this critical mass of interest, of popularity. And that people were writing really interesting stuff on Twitter, but there was no way to know if I'm interested in sports or news, who should I follow? So I had this idea, along with my co-founder, that we could build a website where anyone could just vote with a tweet for who they thought was the best on Twitter by that topic. And now, of course, it's commonplace. You vote for anything on the web, they tell you share it on Twitter, share it on Facebook. No one had ever done that up until that point. So we built the first system to let you vote with a tweet, launched it. And again, of anything I'd ever launched, I thought the Shorty Awards had the least potential to be an ongoing business. I thought this was just kind of for fun.
Ironic.
And within those first 24 hours, it became the top trending term on Twitter. We got coverage from New York Times, Wall Street Journal, BBC, all wrote about us without us even pitching them on it. And so it was tremendous interest. And then I announced, okay, we'll do the show now in 2 months after it got popular. And then it was just a mad scramble. So I was able to get Pepsi and the Knight Foundation to back it as our first sponsors. We flew in winners from around the world. We did the first award ceremony at a very cool venue in Dumbo, Brooklyn, back when Dumbo was just an up-and-coming neighborhood. So it was this huge hit, and really blew me away. And in a way, it was the opposite experience that I'd had with my podcast advertising network, where with that, it was a long slog, nobody cared. to launching something else that I thought was a much worse idea on paper, but then ended up exceeding that. But it was all those skills that I'd honed running the other businesses that I was able to deploy in those 2 months to rapidly pull this thing together as a business, where had the Shorty Awards been my first business, I don't think I could have executed like I did in 2 months.
And I'm also sitting here thinking about the importance of timing, and how when we compare launching the podcast to launching the podcast ad company to the Shorties, timing was right. So this year, Best in Music, interestingly, was won by a K-pop band, Blackpink. For subscribers who are not familiar with that musical genre, could you describe it? It's actually quite interesting.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. I should say, actually, the Shorties have evolved since that first year where we now award. It's all of social media. So it's also what they're posting to Instagram, to YouTube, as well as Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, etc. But K-pop is this kind of movement out of Korea where there are these Korean bands that have taken off internationally, and their fans, and of course, I mean, they're huge in Korea, but they're huge outside of Korea. But what really struck us was that they're particularly good at using social media to get their message out. But even more than that is that their fans are particularly active on social media. So they blow away, most of the big pop stars we have in America in terms of like their social media.
The size of their following.
Yeah, the size of it, and more than the size, it's how emphatic the followers are. So it's both they have a really big following, but then also those followers are much more engaged.
And it's sort of an interesting, I've looked at a little bit of it, interesting mix of animation and reality sort of mixed together.
Yeah, that's right. They're kind of very inventive about how they use media in a way. I think they're good inspiration, I think, for American artists now.
How would you like to see the Shorties evolve over the next 5 years?
Yeah, what we see is that the creativity that happens on online platforms like YouTube and Instagram influence culture as much as movies and other big platforms, and that there are a lot of amazing creators on these platforms that really connect with their audiences and have really powerful, authentic messages. So we've already built the biggest award show honoring social media, and now we honor all kinds of digital media. But what our ambition is to make the Shorties as big as the Oscars or Golden Globes or any other major award show, because we see these really powerful content creators and their fans really care. Often they're reaching bigger audiences than a lot of TV shows. And our challenge is that even though the Shorty Awards are already in their 11th year, we're still a baby in the award show business. Oscars have been around for over 80 years. And there's such a degree where it takes a while to build them because they only come around once a year. There's also this element too where they have to be around for a long time, to build credibility. Because to us now, the Oscars are as credible as can be, and they all started before any of us were born. But I can only imagine in the second year of the Oscars, people are like, "What is this thing? And what are these talking pictures?" So we're excited to build into that. The other element that's fun about the Shorties is that whereas other award shows, the mediums they honor don't change that much. Like the Oscars haven't had to really change since they added sound to movies. For the Shorties, these platforms are changing all the time. Vine starts, Vine dies, Instagram adds stories, TikTok takes off. So we're always changing up the Shorty Awards to stay relevant. And
what do you think the next hot social media platform is, looking ahead?
I wish I knew, but I think I see TikTok is continuing to grow and be really powerful at that demographic. And I think the main lesson I've learned is that it's never going to be what you predict, because everyone sees the current trends. So right now, for example, it's all about stories.
Yeah.
So it's tempting to make a prediction like, somebody else will start a new social network that'll be even better for stories. And I don't think that's how it's going to work, because the current platforms that are doing stories have really done that, and it's hard to displace an incumbent by just optimizing something. So I think whatever comes next, it'll be totally out left field and something that seems
Completely new
insane to us.
innovation rather than
Yeah, completely new.
improving Instagram stories.
That's right. And I'm sure it'll be derided also, because you think about everything we're using now. When Twitter first came out, everyone was like, oh, who wants to read what someone has for lunch? And what could you say in 140 characters? Facebook just seemed like the silly thing for college students.
Yeah.
YouTube also, it's just, kids in their bedrooms with webcams.
Right.
Snapchat, is of course thought of only for sexting, and they come up with the story feature that is now the most popular, the fastest growing feature across many social networks. So I'm sure whatever's the next big thing, everybody will think is really stupid.
Initially.
That's right, yeah.
So the other business of yours is Muck, and that was founded subsequent to the Shorties. What led up to the creation of that?
Yeah, so when we launched the Shorties, one thing that really struck me was how much the press cared about it. Because from launching other businesses that I'd done, I knew getting the press to write about something new is really hard. You have to pitch them, and they're skeptical, and it takes months and months and months. Whereas with the Shorties, just within 24 hours of launching it, we had New York Times, Wall Street Journal, BBC all reach out to us. I remember the Wall Street Journal reporter even came out to Brooklyn to meet me, to interview me. And back then, nobody wanted to go to Brooklyn for business. So I was like, what's happening here?
Yeah.
So I saw, a few months after the Shorties, and I saw this trend, like, all right, let's launch a site where you can just see all the journalists on social media and see what they're writing about. And launched that as Muck. And again, first version, we built it in 2 weeks, very minimal investment and no business model. And my philosophy is, like, if you can launch a site cheap enough, like, you can figure out the business model later. If it's just going to cost you millions of dollars to build the thing, then you better have a business model.
And that defies a lot of conventional wisdom.
Yeah, exactly. You still go to business school or read an old business book, and they say you got to have your 80-page business plan. It would take me more
before you do
time.
Anything, yeah.
That's right. It would have taken me more time to write the 80-page business plan than it did to launch the
right.
The
and then
site.
The timing would be off.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So built it in two weeks and launched Muck, and we ran it for a couple of years on the side of the Shorty Awards. And over those 2 years, tried a few other ideas. But over those 2 years, Twitter got a lot more popular with journalists. We had over 10,000 requests to get listed on Muck.
Amazing.
All because Muck was like kind of the watering hole for journalists to find each other. And I kept running into PR people. This is New York, so there are a lot of PR people out there. And they would all tell me, like, oh yeah, I love Muck. I'm using it to figure out who to pitch. And after hearing this like a dozen times, I'm like, oh wait, there's probably a business there. Like, they're using our website for this like very integral business problem. And we didn't even build our website for that. So we're like, oh, if we keep all the tools free for journalists, but then build out a part, especially for PR people, and charge for it, that could be a great business.
Great subscription business, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And then from doing the Shorty Awards, it's always been profitable, and it's been a great business, but it was challenging because every year have to start from zero, and we'd sometimes sweat like we'd have to cover all the costs, and that was always a bit nerve-wracking at the beginning. Whereas I looked at SaaS, what we now call SaaS businesses, software as a service, basically meaning that instead of sending out a disk to somebody to install on their computer, you have a website they can log into and you charge to use it. So I saw these SaaS businesses looked really appealing because so long as you serve your customers well and they don't cancel, you can count on more revenue coming in. So that made the SaaS model very appealing. And anyhow, so we relaunched it back in December 2011 as a SaaS platform. And the rest has been history. We just kept growing it and growing it.
Is there synergy between the two businesses, would you say? Do you cross-leverage or?
Yeah, there's some. One is that we have kind of shared services between the two. So we have one accounting team and one human resources team and one office. So that makes it a bit easier. But more than that, broadly, it's in the same kind of ecosystem where the Shorty Awards, we're honoring, we both do honor journalists. We have a category for them. We honor marketers and PR people for their best campaigns on social media. And then with Muck, we're serving PR people with our paid product and then journalists with our free product. So definitely kind of gets us in the room with a lot of great people and similar community. And we've leveraged a lot from one to the other, where we just build a relationship with somebody through one and tell them about the other.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears a bit and talk about how in building Muck you've defied some of the key Silicon Valley assumptions. One of them being the importance of venture capital for tech startups to grow, and the other, the importance of locating in a tech center such as Silicon Valley. So first, venture capital. How have you grown Muck without venture capital? Did you ever consider it?
Yeah, we considered venture capital, but decided not to raise it. And we pretty much bootstrapped it the whole way. We don't have any venture capital or institutional investors. And it's been really empowering for a few different reasons. One is that we could focus totally on the customers. And I've seen it with friends of mine who raise venture capital, that once you raise venture capital, first of all, while you're raising, and it usually takes at least 3 months to raise, even if things are going well, and often 6 months plus if things are going poorly, or it's just not a hot market, due to factors outside of your control. The founder or CEO has to spend the vast majority of their time fundraising. And even when they're done fundraising, they then have to spend probably about a third of their time managing their investors. And then the VC model works where they want you to spend the money and grow. And usually after you've raised, you plan to have 12 to 18 months runway, meaning that you can go 12 to 18 months before you run out of money and need another round of financing. So that means that you're just only going to get a year to build stuff if you're lucky, and then you have to spend all this time
raising money again.
Yeah, exactly, raising money. So we figured, like, hey, what if we just took all that time we would have spent raising money and spent all that time talking to customers and closing more deals? We just thought, like, hey, well, we can get cash from the customers. We get cash from the customers. We don't have to dilute ourselves. And then it's also kind of germane to the business, because that means that what do we have to do to get cash from the customers? We have to build useful features. We have to give great customer service. We have to communicate our message to them. So every time we were thinking, like, oh, we want to grow faster, maybe we could raise money from VCs, we just say, let's go out and raise money from customers. And it has some other effects too, because when you do venture capital, you always have to plan for this super high growth. We've always grown quickly, but what happens to these VC companies usually is they push the growth so fast, they double their staff in 6 months, or they launch some new initiative they haven't really looked into or don't feel passionate about. And they try that, and then 3 months later, they have to lay people off. And of course, when you do a layoff, it creates a lot of distraction. I'm really proud, like, we haven't grown as fast as some VC-backed companies, but we've never had to do a layoff. We've never made any, like, huge gut-wrenching mistakes. So I think because of that, we've been able to build a lot more carefully. And there are a lot of things unique to our culture, like the other question you brought up, where we've been able to do a lot of things differently than most VC-backed companies would have, because we didn't have to convince a bunch of investors that it's okay to do things in this, what looked like a weird way.
And it sounds as if based on how you describe that, to some extent, VC capital can be a distractor from the primary thing you need to do, which is address customer needs and build your business organically. Now, what about locating in New York City? Why did you say no to Silicon Valley? Why is Muck in Soho?
There are a few different reasons why we're in New York. One is, even though we're a tech company, it has all to do with media, journalism, public relations, and of course, New York is the hub for that. So, we're much more plugged into the scene. There's also a tremendous amount of new talent that comes to New York every year. But if I have to be honest, I just love New York. I think it's an amazing city, and I want to knock Silicon Valley, and a lot of people love it out there. But personally, New York City is so much bigger than San Francisco. You have so many different industries in New York City. I think a lot of people miss that, where San Francisco is a company town. It's tech.
Surrounded by techies.
That's right. I remember, like, I'd go out there and I'd go to just parties of friends of mine out there. Everyone's in tech. Here, you go to someone's party, you meet a journalist, you meet a writer, you meet someone in fashion, you meet someone in book publishing, and you meet people in tech and people in finance. So in New York, I just found it like so interesting having such a diversity of diversity in all factors, but also diversity of what industries people are in. But then I think that makes it really interesting as an entrepreneur because you get to cross-pollinate all these ideas and spot ideas in other industries. Whereas if you're in San Francisco, all you're thinking about is tech. And there's a lot of groupthink in San Francisco. I love going out there. I go out there several times a year. And I do find it challenging in many regards. I mean, maybe stimulating is a better word. I talk to them and they definitely know what they're doing. And they're very up on tech trends. But they also, when you're in San Francisco, you forget like everybody else doesn't work this way. Like there's still people today who are trying ride sharing for the first time or who are, trying, who don't know what it means to be in a city with scooters all over the place and everything like that.
So they're kind of insulated.
Yeah, they can be insulated and they take things for granted, kind of not realizing like what the normal people need, what mass market needs. New York, I think, keeps you a bit more grounded.
Keeps you more current with what's happening and what people need. To what extent is it important for you that your values are reflected in what you do as an entrepreneur?
I think that's the most important thing. I mean, that's why, for me, if I wanted to make money, and I think most entrepreneurs, if you rationally care about making a lot of money, entrepreneurship, risk adjusted, is a really bad way to do it because it's so much safer to be, a banker or an attorney or any one of these careers where you can probably reliably make lots of money every year of your career without any huge loss. Whereas in the entrepreneurial game, of course, you go and I went many years without making a lot less money than a lot of my junior employees now because that's what the business needed and everything needed to be reinvested into it. And then there's no guarantee that you're ever going to make money or that you're ever going to make a lot of money based on how the business grows. And anyone who's got a large business, you have to think they care more about the money because they could have sold that business and been set, but instead they decide to keep operating it with all the risk and headaches that entails. So, for me, starting a business is all about creating something new from scratch and then creating something new from scratch that I believe in and that kind of, follows my values, my vision, and is something that I can be proud of.
So I hear the value of creativity, learning. Any others that stand out to you?
Yeah, it's all that, of course. Another one is being super focused on the customer and being customer, we call it being customer devoted, but just that idea that the customer asks us a question, they might ask does your software do this? I mean, if it does, of course, we'll show them how, but maybe we see inherent in their question, they really want to know, they're really trying to accomplish something else. And can we go out of our way to help them accomplish that? Even if our software doesn't do it, can we give them tips on how to get done what they want to get done? And I try to show it as CEO, or I'll personally go meet with customers all the time, even though we're at a scale where I don't need to do any customer support or sales, but I'm always going along. And even next week, I'm going to Seattle. I'm meeting with a bunch of our customers out there and listening to them, hearing their problems. I'll kind of jump in if people are posting internally on Slack. Customers asking, how do we do this? I'll sometimes throw out ideas there. I'll read through the feedback they have to kind of inform the larger strategy of the company and the product. But I try to just show it myself that let's not forget, it's not about the CEO. It's not about us being this great software. It's about how can we help the customers. And I think that's what that mentality can keep us successful because we have to keep changing the product. The market's always changing. We have to keep people come and go from the company, although we have very good retention. But the thing that's constant is if we're focused on the customer, we can see how their needs are changing and keep changing our product before it becomes obsolete.
Yeah. And I hear a lot of humility in that too. It's not about status and prestige and money for you. It's about being able to address the need and the satisfaction of creating something. So, we've talked about how being an entrepreneur has a certain cachet right now in American society for sure, sort of a zeitgeist of our times. To what extent do you think an entrepreneurial mindset can be learned, or is it something that's just innate?
Yeah, that's always been the debate. I think that there's a spectrum of people with how much kind of risk they're willing to take, and also how passionate they are about wanting to create things. So I don't think everybody can be an entrepreneur. But I do think that, within that spectrum, there's always been, there's maybe there is the couple percent of people who are super entrepreneurial and will do it hell or high water. And there are some people who just want a corporate job and can work 9 to 5 and know if they do X, they'll get their promotion on Y date. But I think there are a lot of people in the middle where they lean entrepreneurial, they want to create something, but they never quite had that opportunity to take the leap. And I think that's something that we can all help with by giving people more stories. Like, that's why I started the podcast. And what you're doing here, where if they hear more entrepreneurs, how they did it. And there's always that model: the second you meet an entrepreneur who you think is dumber than you and was successful, that's when you're like, oh, I could do that, or at least no smarter than you. So some of it is just seeing like, oh, entrepreneurs are human beings, maybe I can do it too. Having access to a lot more of the practical resources, and the internet's gotten much better about that. Like, now, if you want to know how to structure a financing round or how to empower your first salesperson, there are lots of blog posts on that. Whereas even 10 years ago, even though the internet existed, there just wasn't a lot of content about that out there. And then I think also giving people more financial education, because what I find happens to a lot of people is that to start a company, you do need usually some wherewithal, and even if it doesn't cost a lot to start, if you have a really fancy lifestyle and it exceeds what you're making, it's really hard to start a business. Whereas if you live very frugally and you also, maybe you first need a job, or you find some other source of income, but you're personally cash flow positive, it gives you a lot more breathing room to start up. So, and of course, some people are just more fortunate in life for a variety of reasons, and some are less. But I think we can all help, at least with people where there's an opportunity to, kind of optimize their life to be able to take that entrepreneurial risk versus just having that dream and being stuck working in a corporate job.
And who inspires you?
Yeah, there are a lot of people. A lot of people who I'd interviewed on my podcast were big inspirations to me. My parents, who were both journalists, inspire me for very different reasons. I've had many mentors along the way who've helped me out and given me ideas. I also think about historical characters like Ben Franklin, who'd started the post office, and I believe the world's first volunteer fire department, and newspapers himself. So I think there's a lot of great sources of inspiration. I always like to think back to I think those sources of inspiration are particularly good to think about when things are going poorly, because you always think about these people who've gone on to achieve these great things, and most of them have had these really awful moments in their careers. Just remembering all these other people have bounced back from worse is a powerful thing.
All these trials and tribulations, drawing from the Steve Jobs story, being fired from your own company, seeing how it all was not time wasted, but eventually led to something. And looking across all industries, who do you think are some of the most important innovators of our time?
Yeah, in terms of big innovators now, I think, of course, as you mentioned, Steve Jobs' legacy still looms large over all of us, and he did so much to push the whole mobile, so many things in general, the mobile revolution. Looking at Bill Gates now with his legacy with Gates Foundation, this whole new way, but it's been interesting watching Microsoft make themselves over where everybody thought they were done for. And now all of a sudden, they've acquired LinkedIn, they've acquired a lot of really GitHub, a lot of cutting edge companies, and as well as, made the Microsoft suite relevant again and at least competitive with Google's product. So that's been really interesting to see. I think also just seeing the way that Google is going through a lot of trials and tribulations now. But one of my big inspirations is this guy Andy Grove, who is the former. He's actually a Hungarian immigrant who escaped both the Holocaust and then the Iron Curtain and the Cold War to come to America as a child, and became one of the first employees at Intel and ultimately became their CEO. He wrote a great book called High Output Management that has all these ideas around like doing regular one-on-ones with your direct reports and setting up what are called OKRs, objective key results, to be transparent about company priorities. And he recently passed away, but then Google adopted his OKR system as well as many other companies. And I think that's been fascinating to see this whole school of really thoughtful, transparent management, which I think, of course you could argue about the particulars of it and people are always updating it with technology. But I think just this world we live in now where companies are being more thoughtful about how they build their own systems and how they manage and how they innovate, I think makes a big difference for both the happiness of employees and people who work at companies, and also because they can do better work, ultimately for just regular citizens because they get access to better goods and services.
Top 3 book recommendations for entrepreneurs.
High Output Management, as I mentioned. I think Andy Grove wrote a particularly good book and extremely practical book for just knowing how to get things done. Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull. It's an amazing book. He's the founding CEO, or at least the CEO for the majority of Pixar. Pixar's history, and pretty much was the CEO out, got into movies, and ultimately was acquired by Disney. But it's a fascinating book on how even for something like coming up with animated movie or computer animated movie ideas, that you have to be extremely deliberate in how the management of the companies run to allow for that creativity and create that safety for it. That one's huge. And then also the Steve Jobs biography by Walter Isaacson is an amazing read. And Steve Jobs definitely had a dark side to him, and many demons that drove him too. But just kind of getting that through reading it, this expansive view of how the computer industry grew up and what it was like launching these businesses is a great read.
Yeah, and how all his seemingly unconnected, unrelated experiences ended up somehow translated into what he did later. Yeah. That's
right. Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of people go wrong, where they want to get into business. They look at how people did it before, and they do these super structured paths based on what people have done before. But then you look at the ones who really break out, and they're the ones who bring these different connections together. Steve Jobs famously, I think he called it like marrying liberal arts and engineering, or that wasn't quite how he put it, but somewhere along those lines, because he was big into poetry and
calligraphy,
meditation. Yeah, calligraphy.
The Hare Krishnas. Yeah.
Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, had an interesting way of putting it, where he was saying that, of course, Dilbert's the #1 business comic, and he was saying that he was definitely not the best person at drawing comics, and he wasn't the best business person, but he had the best combination in being able to draw and being a business person, and that's what made Dilbert successful. I think there are many opportunities like that in life where it's not that it's really hard to be the best at one thing, but if you've got several different interests and you pull them together in a unique way, that's often where the opportunity is.
So my final question, do you have any words of advice for someone who may be listening or watching who's toying with the idea of an entrepreneurial venture but ambivalent? What would you say to them to help them make the decision?
I'd say a few different things. One is try to set up your life so that you can take risks. So if you're, that means basically don't commit to spending any more money than you need to spend. If you have a choice between a fancy apartment or a simple apartment, get the simple apartment. Fancy car, cheap car, get the cheap car, so that you have some financial wherewithal. But then also, really think through like how big a risk trying the business would take. A lot of people think of, the human mind is very risk averse, and you can get uncomfortable with risk, so you don't analyze it. So a lot of people think like, I could try starting this business, but if it doesn't work, it's a failure, and I'm going to be a failure the rest of my career, and I'll be bankrupt and on the street. But a lot of times when you actually sit down and you think through what happens if this doesn't work, and you do the math, what happens if this doesn't work, maybe you can attempt the business in a way where failure is, you lose half your savings, but you still have your other half, and you can go back to work and build it back up. Or maybe failure is, you just have to go back and apply to a new job in 2 years. And you lost those 2 years of your career track you were on, but you can start over, and maybe that experience of having been an entrepreneur will actually make you more appealing to employers, which I've actually seen happen before. So thinking through that worst case, when you actually analyze, you might realize like, hey, the worst case, it's not that bad. So why not just give it a shot?
Well, thank you very much, Greg, for being a guest today.
Great. Thanks for having me on. This was great.
Thank you for tuning in to this installment of Iconoclasts. I've been interviewing Greg Galant, CEO and co-founder of Muck and CEO and executive producer of the Shorty Awards.